Hi, welcome to the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection of the University of Virginia. Today we have something really special for you. We're going to take you on a journey through the exhibition With Her Hands, Women's Fibre Art from Gapuwiyak, the Louise Hamby gift. This is an extraordinary exhibition of women's artworks from Gapuwiyak, a small community in Arnhem Land. It was curated by 6 amazing young women, Barry-Ann Franks, Antoinette Griffin, Hannah Jeffries, Helen Martinez, Diana Proenza, and Victoria Morales Rodriguez. They came here as part of the UVA Mellon Indigenous Arts Initiative to train curators from underrepresented backgrounds in the museum profession. And the best thing was that they got to work closely curating this exhibition with Louise Hamby and the master fibre artists Lucy Wanapoingu and Anna Malabir, who came all the way from Gapuwiyak to help put this exhibition together. Now that's really exciting, and it was really exciting for me because I could learn about these important works that have connected generations of women going back tens of thousands of years. I mean, what a thrill for a curator. But when we were doing it, there would be these times where Lucy Wanapoingu would say, "Now Henry, Napipi, get out, go out. This knowledge is only for women." And so I would have to dutifully come outside the galleries, sit out here with the doors closed, while they talked about that women's business that I wasn't meant to hear. And so today, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to sit out here dutifully, minding my own business, and we're going to let our staff take you through this extraordinary exhibition. We hope you enjoy it.
Louise Hamby is an American anthropologist who lives in Australia. She went to Gapuwiyak, a Yolngu community in Arnhem Land that's 540 miles east of Darwin, in 1995 to undertake research for her PhD. She was specifically looking at baskets, the way they're manufactured, and what they mean to Yolngu people. Louise didn't start off being a collector of fiber arts. It's kind of like when you hang out in a barbershop long enough, you're gonna get a haircut. She started buying baskets from the women who were her closest friends, and over time she diversified her collection. With Her Hands is an important exhibition for many reasons. It shows the breadth of fiber art from one community and also points to the innovations of individual artists. Fiber artworks have been undervalued historically, in part because they're made by women and they've been regarded as craft rather than art, but also because their ceremonial value has not been well understood. They've been regarded as utilitarian objects. This is changing worldwide with the resurgence of interest in fiber arts and the recognition of women artists. The types of artworks that are included in With Her Hands are dilly bags, baskets, string bags, mats, necklaces, and sculptural objects. Louise selected these objects in a thoughtful way to reference the proportions in her larger collection, but also to show the diversity of styles and techniques and the particular contributions of individual artists.
So I imagine you're sitting at home and you're thinking, why? Why would an art museum devote an entire exhibition just to bags and baskets? Why are women making these today, especially when they can just go to the store and buy any bag that they want? Why did they make them in the past? Well, these questions are a lot bigger than they seem, and a lot more labor goes into these works than what it might appear at first glance. These objects are made for so many interrelated reasons. They're utilitarian, of course, but they are also deeply connected to places and ancestors. They are mnemonic devices to help remember people and events. They're made for ceremonies like graduations and funerals. They're made for sale to support families and communities. The making of them is a social event. And on top of it all, of course, they're also made for fun as profound statements of individual artistic expression. Let's start with the obvious. Let's start with the utilitarian purpose of these objects. Really tightly twined baskets, like the one that you see here, These have been made for thousands of years, and we know this because they're represented in rock art across the area of Arnhem Land in northern Australia. When they're tightly twined like that, they would have been lined with beeswax or a resin, and so that the basket could carry things like honey or water. When they're more loosely twined, they would have carried larger objects like bush yams or perhaps the results of a successful hunt, and sometimes they were even used to leach toxins out of poisonous seeds or roots so that they could be edible. The other kind of bag is a looped bag, like the one that you see here. Loop bags historically were used to carry things, but the mesh of them were also sometimes applied to make fishing or animal nets. Today, they're the item most used by women personally to carry things like groceries or personal items, and really it's no wonder. They're incredibly convenient. They fold up to a tiny size, but they can also expand to hold lots of items, and they're incredibly durable because they're actually made of wood. This object above the mantle was used as a skirt historically to cover women who were pregnant. It's not used this way today, but this object can also be thought of as a reference to a three-dimensional conical mat that was made from pandanus that was used in a number of ways. One way was as a protective covering from the sun or the elements, and another way was that it was sometimes folded to use as a working surface.
Fiber objects play a role in the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Mats like this are a really good example. They relate to the stories of ancestral women like the djan'kawu, who carried conical mats under which they gave birth to the clans of Arnhem Land. Women used to make conical mats, and it wasn't until missionaries arrived and convinced them that the flat mats would actually be more useful and more saleable as objects that they started making them in this form. This mat was made by an extraordinary artist who used a lot of innovations. For example, this open weave here where she's crossing over the fibers. She also was very fond of the use of yellow and red together, and that effect really gives this mat the appearance of a sun. The sun is part of the djan'kawu sisters' story. The djan'kawu sisters traveled from east to west following this path of the sun. There are a lot of metaphors that are used to describe fiber objects. One of those is the navel, and that's the starting place right here at the center of the mat. It's a tightly woven beginning that the mat radiates out from. Some women have even sculpted ancestors in fiber. For example, Penny Wanapungu made this dolly that represents one of the Wagalag sisters. The Wagalag sisters were ancestral beings who traveled across Arnhem Land and created many of the features of the landscape, such as waterholes.
The sale of fiber objects to non-Indigenous people began in the early 20th century with missionary presence and influence in Arnhem Land. One of the things that the missionaries really wanted was to instill a work ethic in Aboriginal people. They thought that this would help them assimilate into non-Indigenous culture better, and they also felt that it would make it easier to convert them to Christianity. Another way that missionaries influenced the production of fiber forms was that they really encouraged the women to make mats flat rather than conical. The reason for this was that they thought they would sell better to non-Indigenous people in urban areas if the works could be hung on a wall, used as a mat on a floor, or laid on a table under a fruit bowl, for example. If they were going to be laid on a table, the excess fringe was undesirable, and so a lot of women were encouraged to start making mats that had closed edges rather than fringed edges.
The area surrounding Gapuwiyak is quite varied in terrain. It includes rocky outcrops, it includes open forest, it includes streams and waterholes, and even just 25 miles away, the ocean, which is a long distance if you're walking, but isn't so bad if you're in a car. The women of Gapuwiyak know this area like the back of their hand. Now, if you and I were going to make a basket, we would go to the store or we would shop online. But for the women of Gapuwiyak, the store is all around them in the natural world, and they make great use of it. The problem is you have to know where to go to gather your materials. And luckily, the women of Gapuwiyak have deep, deep ties and knowledge that tells them exactly where to go when they're looking for specific materials. So let's talk about some of the materials you'll see here in these fiber works. This mat here, made by Linda Biringal, is made from one of the most common materials you'll find in Gapuwiyak, which is called pandanus. Pandanus comes from a tree that's a palm tree called Pandanus spiralis. And it grows throughout northern Australia, but it really loves to grow in areas that are slightly wet. So you might find it near water holes, things like that. The women use only the leaves from the Pandanus tree. And so what they have to do is they have to pull the leaves down. Sometimes these trees, which can grow up to 30 feet or so, are a little bit above reach. So the women have gotten very clever and they create hooks out of other tree branches and pull them down. When the right amount of leaves are gathered, then the women sit down and start to process the leaves on site. And that's because they really only want a particular part of the leaf. These leaves, which are quite big, say 3 to 6 feet, have thorny sides along the edge. And so this is actually quite grueling work because what the women are doing is they're taking the edges of the leaf and sort of splitting them off and only pulling out the center part of the leaf. Once the leaf is stripped and that center part is pulled out, it's set out in the sun to dry. And the end result is something that's going to look like this. It's a series of fibers that look like sort of almost like dry straw. It doesn't look like much in this form, but once the women of Gapuwiyak start to add color by dyeing it and then start working it into their bati, their baskets, you'll see it actually becomes quite amazing. So let's look at another material that's used all the time, and that's balgur, which comes from the kurrajong tree. The kurrajong tree actually grows in an area that's slightly different than the pandanus. It grows in open forest. So the women have to know where to go find that kurrajong tree. The women look for small saplings, sort of young trees, and they chop them down and gather them. And then they build a small fire and actually start to put those saplings over top of the fire, just very gently to heat the sapling, because what they're looking for is the outside bark of the tree. So in order to get the bark off, this involves a little bit of heat, and then a little bit of pounding, and then a little bit of heat, and a little bit of pounding. And eventually that bark will separate off of that sapling. And eventually what you will find, what you're looking for, is this very thin, delicate, and yet incredibly strong layer of inner bark, what we would call the cambium. And this is what it would look like once it's dry. Now all that, and you still haven't made any string yet. Let's see what's next. So you can see by looking at this board that there's quite a range of colors that the women are able to actually achieve with dyes. Most of these colors come from plants, and I want to start by showing you one of the most common plants that is used for dyeing. This is a root that's called jundun, or yellow one, and it's a very common color. It's probably the most common color in Gapuwiyak. It comes from a tree. It comes from a tree that actually lives in sort of a very rocky terrain. So actually the women know that if they want to dig this root, it's always best to do it when the ground is soft. And you start digging down and you expose part of the root when you find the first root, and then you slowly start excavating this root out until you want to be careful because you don't want to break this outside surface off the root. Once you're able to gather some roots like this, you let it dry, and then what happens is you actually are going to start pounding and sort of scraping this outside surface off of the root. It's almost like the bark of the tree, but it's on the root. That's the part that has the color. Once you've got that done, you've also got a pot of boiling water over your fire, and you take your chips, your pulpy mass, and you put them into the pot of boiling water. And then you put your pandanus in there, and you literally can sort of watch this pandanus turn yellow before your eyes. The longer you leave it in, the more yellow it is. The fresher the dye bath, the more yellow it is. It can become a little bit more orange as you leave it in. And there's even a secret that Lucy taught us, which is that you can add coconut ash to the pandanus that you've dyed yellow. You can add coconut ash into the dye bath, and it actually immediately turns the yellow fiber red. And red is a wonderful color, so every artist around the world loves red. So the ability to make red out of something that looks like this is pretty remarkable. I'm going to show you one more material that Lucy and Anna brought from Gapuwiyak for us, and these are small bulbs which grow under the ground. Their upper plant is kind of a leafy plant, and these are called yringaning. And this is also nicknamed what they call the brown one. And so, as you can guess, it makes a brown kind of a dye. These are dug up. The plant grows. You have to dig very vertically down into the earth because if you just pull from the top, the leaves come off. So you dig down, you sort of dig underneath, and you can lift a whole clump of these together. And then they're kind of a mess. So you really got to clean them off, clean all the extra, not just the dirt, but also sort of roots and things like that. And what you're left with are these small little almost bulbs, and they're dried out. Once again, when you're ready to make your dye bath, you have to pound these between rocks and get sort of a pulpy mass. And then just like the jundum, you're going to take these, you have a pot of boiling water next to where you're working. You put these into the boiling water, you put your pandanus or your other fiber in, and you get many, many variations of brown. Wow, okay, so we've gathered our materials, we've dyed them to the color we want, and we are finally ready to make an object. That's how much work it takes to make some of these objects. So let's talk about a few of the techniques that the women of Gapuwiyak use to make their objects. The first one, and probably the most important one, because it's the oldest technique that we know of, and really it's the oldest technique that's used all around the world, is called twining. And twining is a technique where you take two strands of a fiber and you wrap them around another fiber that's going in a different direction, and you twist. And so what happens with a dilly bag like this, which is made with twining technique, is they start off by making a center, the navel, and they really start off by creating a series of spokes. So it almost looks like a star or a starfish. And each of these, and then you start wrapping this pandanus around each of those spokes, twisting every time you go around a single spoke. Go around, twist, go around, twist, go around, twist. And what happens is you slowly build that surface up. And depending on how tightly you twist it or how loosely you twist it, it holds together really beautifully and tightly. Or if you're a beginner like me, often it's really kind of a mess. It takes a lot of practice to use this technique. The artists of Gapuwiyak use this technique. They alternate their colors. They are able to add in colors whenever they want them. You can see on this dilly bag how they have stripes. A stripe is easy because you just kind of a continuous color. But when you start getting into things where you almost have like a checkerboard kind of pattern, you start to realize the incredible skill that these ladies have when they're making these objects. The other technique that's on this wall is the introduced technique of coiling. And you can see this is a dilly bag, a long cylindrical bag. This is a traditional object for the women of Gapuwiyak. And if you move over here, look at these bags here, you can see these actually are sort of the same shape, but they're actually made with that other technique, coiling. And in this technique, what the artists do is they actually create sort of a bundle of fiber. And then they take their outside fiber, their fiber that they're actually sort of manipulating, and they take that fiber and they start going around that bundle and wrapping it. So that what you're seeing here is the outside fiber, which is wrapping around that bundle. This technique is tricky because you need to have a needle, because you need to, in order to attach one bundle to the other, to the other, to the other, and get this nice series of rows, you have to use a needle to tie that layer into the previous one. You use a stitch called a button stitch. Also on this wall, you'll notice that a lot of these bags have string handles. So the string, okay, the string is the hardest thing, I think, to make in this whole series. It really takes a master craftswoman to make string. The string is made from the kurrajong, from the inside bark that we talked about. And the way it is made is that you take 2 strips of this kurrajong fiber, and there's a very specific way you have to make this. You have to sit on the ground, you have to have a bare leg, so the women wear skirts, and they pull their skirt up, and you have a bare thigh, and let's pretend this is my thigh for a second, and you have 2 strands of this kurrajong fiber, and you use the palm of your hand to roll those 2 strands down your thigh, and while you're doing that, you're compressing and twisting the 2 separate strands, and then you actually take your hand and you roll it back up, which twists those 2 strands together into a twisted string, a 2-ply string. This makes an unbelievably strong you can pull on it and it doesn't come apart. It makes an unbelievably strong string, but oh man, it is hard to do. The last technique I want to show you is a technique which involves the string again, And it's these net bags. And these bags, this entire bag is made out of basically one piece of continuous string. So first of all, think about the fact you've got to know how to make that string, right? You can't make these bags if you don't know how to make the string. And then you also are going to make this, since this is a continuous piece of string, you're constantly adding. You'll make a big long lengths, but chances are you'll have to add. You can change colors just the way you might if you were knitting or something. And the way that these bags are made is not too dissimilar to knitting. It's a single strand of string that's looped beside each other, and you kind of make loops, 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 and they're all kind of tied together. And then you go down to the next row, and that row is looped to the next row. And so it's this kind of continuous, seamless spiral of loops that actually end up making this string bag. And it creates not just a beautiful bag, but an incredibly strong bag made from, yes, the bark of a tree.
One of the reasons I love this exhibition, and one of the reasons why it's so exciting, is not only the sheer diversity of the objects on view and how each one is unique, but even more than that, how these artists are really pushing the boundary of the medium that they're working with. I'm reminded of Van Gogh or Picasso or even artists in the early Renaissance who were trying to figure out what more they could do with paint on a two-dimensional surface. The women artists of Gapuwiyak are no different. There's lots of ways in which they're innovating and exploring new ideas in their work. One of the ways in which Yolngu women are really getting creative is with their use of color. Now, color within Yolngu art and culture already has a rich and complex history. Certain colors are associated with specific sites in the artist's country, often sacred ones. And when the body is painted up for ceremony with white pigment, it imbues the person with certain kinds of spiritual power or alludes to the spiritual power of ancestral beings. Historically, baskets were painted with natural ochres in order to give them color. For example, in this work, we have an undyed pandanus basket that's been covered with stripes of purple, white, yellow, and navy, all natural pigments found in the landscape. One of the goals of adding color to baskets is to create a sense of motion or brilliance or a shimmering effect. That effect evokes the power and presence of ancestors in the works themselves. One of the ways in which this effect has been achieved with baskets is by twining in fur or feathers to add color and dimension to the work itself. When wool and cloth became available in the early 20th century, those were also twined into baskets in order to give them this sensational feature of motion and movement and brilliance. One of the first innovations in applying color to fiber objects was the transition from moving from using natural pigments painted onto the objects to dyeing the fibers ahead of time with a variety of different colors and then twining in those colors as the object was formed. This is a great example of that because it has a lot of different colors, and there are certain locations where the artist has two-ply twined to create that nice shimmering effect that was achieved with ochres earlier. The interesting thing about this shimmering effect is that it's very similar, especially as you see it here, to the rark or cross-hatching pattern that you see in bark paintings that are made by Yolngu men. We don't really know which one came first. These beautiful transitions of color that create a shimmering effect on pandanus forms, or those beautiful cross-hatching patterns in bark paintings. Another innovation of color is just the insatiable search that these artists have for new and more saturated colors. When Lucy Wanapwengu was here, she talked about seeing fiber forms from neighboring communities in different colors and bartering with them to get whatever natural element was needed for that new or slightly different color. Anna Malabir, when she was here, talked about going to the Gapuwiyak shop and seeing crepe party streamers on the wall and seeing those really bright colors of bright green and bright pink and bright blue. And she wondered if she could make a new dye bath and new colors out of those crepe party streamers. And so she bought a couple colors, took them home, she threw that green into her dye bath, into that boiling water, and it turned the water this beautiful bright green. She threw in her pandanus fibers, and lo and behold, the fibers took on that beautiful bright green, and she suddenly had a new array of rich, saturated color. Now, she wouldn't use that color on a basket or a form that was being made for ceremonies, but for objects that were leaving the community for sale to non-Indigenous people, it was a really exciting discovery for her. One of the ways that women artists at Gapuwiyak are really innovating with the kurrajong string bags is by using a new kind of knot. The bags to this side are looped in the way that Fenella described earlier, but these bags use a new kind of knot called a sheet bend knot that's been adapted from the making of fishing nets. Peniwanapringu is an artist who's playing with the creation of animal and human forms in her work. Her husband is from Managrita, and his relatives have been creating animals out of pandanus for a couple of years before she started. She was inspired by them and decided to try to make some of her own. This crocodile was her first attempt at an animal made from pandanus. She's loosely twined the pandanus fibers together and then has stuffed the crocodile full of paper bark in order to give it its voluminous shape. I think she did a pretty good job for her first attempt. It looks like that crocodile is really swimming through shallow water. Another work that she's done in an animal form is this kangaroo. Louise Hamby affectionately calls it Skippy, and you can see that she is reintroducing the application of paint on her sculptures by using it for the eyes, and in some of her other animal sculptures like emus and turtles and stars, she also uses pigment to add little details. Some artists have even gone so far as to incorporate 2, 3, or even 4 techniques into one form. This basket is a great example of that. We have tight twining, loose twining, cross twining, and also coiling, all in one form.
With Her Hands is an important and globally relevant exhibition for several reasons. It showcases fantastic artworks made by the skilled and knowledgeable fiber artists of Gapuwiyak. It also breaks down arbitrary distinctions between art and craft, instilling value in an art form that has been historically marginalized. Additionally, this exhibition celebrates the contributions made by women artists, collectors, and curators to the art world. We are delighted that Dr. Hamby has given these artworks to the Kluge-Ruhe Collection, where they will inspire our students and the public to learn more about Yolngu culture and the women artists of Gapuwiyak.